Hey, good morning. Welcome to the next session of Nutanix at 9 here with Egroup. Thanks to those of you that were able to join us this morning. I know with a slew of webinars out there, you got plenty to choose from. So appreciate you taking time to join us today. Excited to dig into Nutanix and their files story. We'll have a good number of questions to answer as we get into it. So let's go ahead and get this kicked off. Hopefully everybody here is ready to rock and ready to ask questions in the chat. Cool. So really, before we get started, this will be familiar to a lot of you that may have joined a few of these in the past, but I'll kind of run through what we're doing today as far as an agenda. We've got some news around Nutanix that we'll talk about in the What's New section, and then the bulk of today's presentation will be around the questions and answers section. So we'll be covering kind of the same routine that we've been doing on these past sessions. And then obviously at the outro, we'll leave you with how to get more info and how to get help from Egroup if desired. Before we dig in, wanted to introduce my co-host, Mike Dent. Mike is our Nutanix technology champion. He is a Nutanix technology champion with Nutanix. So it's, what is that? That's twice over, Mike? That you're a Nutanix technology. Yeah, so 2 times. He's on a multiplier now. But Mike brings a lot of experience to this Nutanix at 9 session with a lot of the work that he does with our customers, both in helping build solutions, but also delivering solutions. So looking forward, Mike, to hearing kind of what you've got in terms of Nutanix files and also just general Nutanix knowledge. So thanks again for jumping on board here. I, of course, am Dan Drude. I am an account executive based outside of Washington, D.C. On the sales side. So I do focus a lot on Nutanix, but definitely appreciate being able to work with guys like Mike on my team and getting stuff done for our customers. So real quick, for those of you that don't know Egroup or maybe just haven't tuned into this in the past, Egroup's been around for about 20 years. We are a privately owned, debt-free organization headquartered out of Charleston, South Carolina. I'd like to highlight kind of the privately owned debt-free because it allows us to really kind of develop the portfolio as we see fit. And Nutanix has been a strong piece of that portfolio for probably 5 or 6 years now. So really being able to have that kind of boutique business feel, but deliver the enterprise results. We've got probably closer to 400 customers now across the East Coast in the United States, and we work in a number of different spaces. Usually if you are focused on compliance, on automation, on resiliency and security, we're going to have a tool in our toolkit for you, and Nutanix is often a part of that conversation. So if you have any questions on Egroup, please feel free to throw them in the chat as well. It doesn't have to be just files specific today, but happy to answer any questions there. Real quick, before we jump into the Q&A, as I promised, there are some updates that we wanted to share, just some general kind of news around Nutanix. One of the main things actually specific to file storage and their object storage, as many of you may be aware, Gartner, right, has kind of their magic quadrant and does a lot of reviews on technology vendors. They've also got kind of their customer's choice denotation, right, for different groups that have received X amount of reviews at a certain level of score. And Nutanix files and object storage, that actually kind of hit that tier recently, where there have been enough customers with their feedback on their experience with Nutanix files and object storage that it was recently recognized as kind of a customer's choice solution for what they do in files and object storage specifically. So we have seen that Nutanix is a Gartner leader as a core infrastructure platform, but I definitely thought it was important to highlight the recognition that they've had with Nutanix files because it is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively new within their portfolio. So wanted to call that out. And then also an interesting use case that was recently announced in more of a formal capacity, UNOS, or the United Network for Organ Sharing. They're actually based out of Southern Virginia. They recently moved over to Nutanix to help match donor organs to recipients much faster. They saw a 30% increase in what they were able to do in terms of the databases that they leverage for finding organs and being able to map those to people that need those really kind of life or death scenarios, right? So I thought it was important today just to kind of give a shout out to the Nutanix team and their work with United Network for Organ Sharing, just being able to kind of improve the quality of life for those that are looking for transplants, or those that are able to provide that. I think this is a really kind of mission critical use case that's worth noting here. So with that being said, that's kind of the Nutanix news.
Real quick on that. I think we jumped ahead last Nutanix at 9, where we had a Nutanix news announcement around, I think it was GE PACS.
Yes.
Or some of the GE solutions were certified for use on Nutanix files, right? So we probably jumped ahead with our announcements a little bit to bad timing of topics. But yeah, so we're really seeing Nutanix Files taking off, and as this top one up here with the Gartner announcement, as well as the GE PAX announcement for healthcare with Files. I mean, we're really seeing Files become a really good standard approach for a lot of customers, and vendors are really starting to latch onto that as well.
Yeah, agreed, Mike. I think we'll talk about use cases to a degree, and in our first question coming up here, we'll kind of tie into that, right? Where a lot of groups have been using more of your traditional file solutions that are out there dedicated around file, and the idea of taking something that traditionally is kind of billed as a core infrastructure product and extending that out to Files. Really looking forward to diving into that. So yeah, let's jump right into our first question here. This is one we get a lot, right? Not necessarily specific to NetApp, but to the different file solutions out there. But how does a Nutanix file solution compare to something like your more traditional file solution? What anything you want to start with there, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say NetApp with their filers, right, have become a standard. You've got Dell EMC with Isilon, right? Even the VNX. I mean, there's a number of vendors out there that have provided kind of a scalable file solution over the last 20 plus years, right? And what we're starting to see now is what Nutanix has done with Files is, instead of buying Isilon is probably the best comparison, I think, for Files, in that it's a scale out solution, right? Very easily scalable. I add when I the whole concept of Nutanix, right? I only scale when I need to scale. I add when I need to add. That was kind of the Isilon concept. And so Nutanix brought the file storage concept, the unstructured data, the non-VM data, unstructured NFS, even to some extent objects fitting in with Files. A very simple and scalable solution, but it's all built on the Nutanix platform, right? So all of the features that you get out of Nutanix, the one-click upgrades, the data locality functionality, and simple scalability, they brought that concept to just a simple, unstructured, organized kind of concept, right? With NetApp or Isilon, right? You've got this massive system that's built around this. And Files really is just one piece of that Nutanix has been able to capitalize on to provide a customer, hey, you're already with Nutanix. You like what you get with Nutanix. You like the data locality, the simplicity, Prism, all the things that we know and love about it. But now you can add your Files into that, and then be able to take Files and scale it as you need from a simple perspective. If I need just a little bit of room, I can do it with Files. If I need a massive amount of room, I can do it with a dedicated Files cluster. So different ways to kind of attack all this unstructured data that we have out there, but in the Nutanix world, in the Nutanix ecosystem, a very simple approach.
Okay. And as I understand it, right, and disclaimer, right, sales guy, the legacy solutions like an Isilon or a VNX, even if you were a total Dell shop, that was still kind of a separate solution managed on its own. You had a business resiliency plan for that specific realm of your data center. Nutanix is, what is it? It's like a 3-node minimum or something like that. You still have kind of like the resilience factor across Files, but this is also something that can be managed within what you're using for Nutanix core infrastructure, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the beauty of Files is, everything I need for File, if I'm a Nutanix customer today and I'm running, AHV or ESXi, or, VMware, I've already got the functionality and the pieces in place for Files. So the same place that I'm managing my VMs through Prism, that I'm accounting for storage, I'm doing my data protection. Files is already built into that. So for me to deploy a Files cluster into an already existing environment, I think it's 3 clicks, right? So I can go from having nothing or wanting to consolidate my files from various Windows servers or an Isilon or something else. In 3 clicks, I can have a resilient Files cluster that scale out, scale up, and protect it all within my Nutanix infrastructure in a matter of minutes, right? And here's one key thing that I love to kind of tell every customer that I deploy Nutanix for is, hey, do you guys have a need for Files today? And we probably get into this a little bit later. Do you guys have a need for Files today? If you do, let me deploy it. Every single Nutanix customer out of the box gets 1 TB free of Nutanix Files, right?
Okay.
So if you're a Nutanix customer today and you want to maybe play with it, or you're interested in Files, right, of having that capability, just deploy it. If you don't use it, don't want it, we delete it, right? So you're not having to pay for any licensing just to be able to kind of get the look and feel of files out of the box.
Okay, no, that's great to know. So if you do have Nutanix already, you've actually got the ability to fire files up and give it a run.
Absolutely. And again, if you're using it, great. If you want to be able to scale past that 1 TB that you get for free, you can license it, right? It's licensed based on the amount of TB of storage that you're going to have. That's in addition to VMs and everything else in the cluster. But you've got it, right? So why not deploy it? Give it a run. See if you like it. A lot of times I'll deploy it for customers just so they've got some kind of an installation. They can just store some stuff there, right? And just to get the feel for it. But again, if you're a Nutanix customer, you've already got it.
Awesome. Are there any drawbacks? Sometimes we find that like these dedicated file solutions, they have a pretty robust feature set, but I think in a lot of use cases, right, we find that for a lot of organizations, maybe they're using 70, 80, 90% of a solution with kind of a broader feature set, right? Are there any things that people need to watch out for? Any features that maybe are on the roadmap for Nutanix that other solutions have? Anything that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple scenarios where we've had to. I can think of one customer we had to pull files out. It didn't fit with what they were trying to do. They had a large files deployment, and it was a very kind of heavy hitting files deployment where they had thousands upon thousands of thousands map drives hitting these file servers. And when we worked in Nutanix, basically it came down to, well, the requirements that we were going to have to make files work with in this case just didn't make sense, right? So files, it's going to hit that 90% use case, right? There's going to be that 10% niche that might not fit. Another area where files in Nutanix is working on this with a roadmap perspective is having some level of active capability. So if I need to have kind of an active file server cluster in my primary site and an active file server cluster on my DR site, similar to something that we do with like Microsoft DFS for having a very kind of distributed file system, that doesn't work today. That feature's not there natively, right? So we've got things through like Peer Software, which is a third party that can do some additions or add-ons to the files, but by default, that's probably the one limiting factor I've seen with files, and it's not been a huge one, right? It's been where can I do this? No, I can't. Okay, well, let me rethink this a little bit. It's not a roadblock, but it's just something that people have inquired about. That's kind of on the roadmap. But again, today to leverage kind of an active file scenario, it is a third party. Now, you do still get DR capabilities, right? So I can migrate my file servers from prod to DR, just like we can VMs back and forth, but I don't have that immediate failover, that active type approach with files. So that's probably the number one thing I'd say is in talking with customers, that's probably the one thing that's left out a little bit still from a functionality perspective that I think customers have wanted. But files itself has grown tremendously over the years. That we're now seeing, again, I can put it against an Isilon cluster. I can put it against a Cohesity from a file share, or Cumulo, or some of these other kind of scale out NAS solutions. And files, I think, holds up very well from a functionality and feature perspective against these other vendors as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So I mean, it sounds like if you're on Nutanix core infrastructure, when that time comes, you've probably got some sort of file solution out there. This is definitely something to keep in the mix for comparison, and in all probability, probably is going to check all your boxes unless you've got some of these more, I wouldn't call them fringe use cases, but sometimes it's just, active file systems. I mean, that's not necessarily something you need for, surveillance footage or something where files is typically leveraged.
Exactly right. I mean, we're gonna talk for somebody like that. You're gonna have a massive kind of distributed file share across an environment that's maybe not global, but very site specific, right? And we want to be able to have quick failover and quick data access. That's not there, but again, that's like you said, maybe I wouldn't call it niche or fringe, but it's definitely not a standard use case that's out there.
Cool, makes sense. So we'll probably kind of hit this topic a bunch, as we continue to talk here. But the next question I did want to ask, and we get this a lot with a lot of the different just kind of portfolio products that Nutanix has. Do you need to be running Acropolis Hypervisor, AHV, to use Nutanix files?
Yeah, and again, the freedom of choice from Nutanix is the answer to this is a definite no, right? So it's not a full freedom of choice, meaning I can't run files on any hypervisor that Nutanix does support. It's specifically limited to AHV or VMware, right? So AHV or ESXi, I can't do it on Hyper-V or Zen or one of these other, that's pretty much it. So it is dedicated to AHV or to VMware. From a cluster perspective. Now, there's also kind of a third option from a files kind of perspective, is that if I have an existing AHV cluster, I can deploy files there. If I have an existing ESXi cluster, I can deploy files there. Or there's kind of that third use case where I have a dedicated files cluster, which does not run VM workloads, but it still runs AHV. So if we kind of look at where files is supported, I can have an existing ESXi cluster that running VMs and doing all my daily workloads, add files there. Have my AHV cluster with my VM workloads, add files there, or have a third kind of configuration for a standalone dedicated files cluster that would be files only and no VM workloads can run there. So yeah, really you're losing Hyper-V or Zen server can't run files today.
Okay, that's good to know. You mentioned kind of that flexibility, right? The freedom of choice that Nutanix generally offers. If I had a core infrastructure cluster, running on Supermicro, their NX platform,
yep.
Does files also need to be on NX, the Supermicro platform, or could that, in theory, be like a DX running on HPE equipment?
Could be DX, could be XC Core. It could be Lenovo. Could be any platform that files any platform that Nutanix is supported on. The Nutanix Community Edition, for example. If you've got a home lab or a test dev lab that you're running the Nutanix Community Edition, which is based on AHV, you can run files there, right? So again, any Nutanix platform that is supported, as long as the hypervisor is either AHV or ESXi, you can run files. So again, no limitations there at all, right? And the way we look at these is depending on how much file usage there is, right? We could be looking at some compute nodes and storage nodes. Maybe it's just the compute nodes with a little bit of files, so we don't need a storage node. So again, as we deploy files, we also think about it like we're deploying our VMs, right? We have to size files correctly into our cluster.
Cool, makes sense. Let's jump into this one. We kind of touched on this, right? But how does the file solution, how does that address data availability? What are customers doing to make sure that Nutanix Files has resiliency?
Yeah, so I think it might be helpful to kind of talk about the architecture of files itself. And when we deploy files, again, it's just like a Nutanix cluster. It's deployed with 3 file server VMs. You always start with 3, right? So we have our redundancy there. And then we can scale that out as needed we can scale out on the file server VMs. We can scale up on the file server VMs. All depends on what we need from a files environment, right? Do we need to scale up our VMs to handle more throughput? Do we need to scale out more VMs to handle kind of resiliency? So always start with 3. And I think we just got a question, the default number of file servers created when deploying Nutanix Files. Hey, perfect. I just answered it. Easy. 3. So we always start with 3. And those are typically going to be sized, I think it's 4 vCPU and 12 gigs of memory, right? So not a huge kind of overhead on our cluster typically. So we start with our 3. Then what we need to talk about is what type of file share are we going to deploy? And there's 2 different types of file shares. Basically, a standard or a kind of default share, which is your standard file share, department file shares, folders, just stuff. And those are basically individually mapped to a file server VM. The second type of file share is what we call is a shared or more like a profile storage, right? So it's for storing user profiles, things like that. And that actually gets distributed across all the file server VMs. So architecturally, depending on what type of file share we're going to use, it will either be a standard share where if I create if I create a new share, accounting, right? Accounting gets their share. That goes to file server VM1. If I create HR, that goes to file server VM2 and so forth. And we just kind of keep round robining through there. If I do a distributed share, it's distributed across all the available file server VMs. Now, in the event of a data availability issue where, let's say, a file server VM fails or a node fails, right? The shares would be failed over to the different file servers. So even though we, in a kind of a standard share, we've addressed this share goes to this file server VM, in the event of a failure, that share is failed over. So users would see a brief connection loss as that file server, the file share is failed over between file servers. But again, it follows the same architectural principles of Nutanix, right? Where I can lose something and everything will fail over and I continue to run. So two ways that we're addressing data availability. One, of course, is the redundancy between file server VMs, right? If I lose a file server VM, I can fail, the shares will fail over as necessary. The second data availability principle is going to be, what happens if I lose my cluster, right? What happens if I have to go into a DR scenario? Is with files, we can do the same type of data protection that we do with our VMs. And this is regardless of whether it's VMware or AHV, is I can have snapshot protection on my file data and be able to put that into a protection domain that allows me to then fail over my file data and file server VMs from prod to DR. So again, the whole concept of Nutanix with availability, data locality follows not just from the core platform, but to the files solution itself, whether it's the file server VMs being able to have redundant connections between the different file servers, or from the actual file data itself being able to fail over from prod to DR, for example, if I need to. So kind of a multi-pronged approach for data availability, both internal to the cluster as well as like a availability across sites.
Awesome. I mean, that sounds pretty robust. I'm not sure if we touched on this within that, but I know there was a question that Onward posted, right? What are the default number of file servers created when deploying Nutanix files?
Yeah, so it's always going to be 3, right? We always start with 3, just like our node count, right? Just like we typically start with a three count node cluster. File servers, we always start with a three file server VMs, right? And again, those are, I think, typically scaled at 4 CPU and 12 gigs of memory. We don't allocate storage to the file server VMs. We allocate basically storage to the files solution itself. So like I said, everybody gets 1 TB free files that you can deploy and play with and do whatever. If I need to scale that up, it's basically consuming storage out of the cluster, right? So whatever my logical storage that I have in my cluster, I can pool that for files. So we always start with 3, but again, I can scale both horizontally and vertically. So I can say if I need more file server VMs, right? If I need to have based on load, I can, at the click of a button, just increase from 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and so forth. But also, if I need to have more resources available for those file server VMs, if I've got my 3, I can say instead of 4 CPUs and 12 gigs of memory, I can make it 8 CPUs and 20 gigs of memory, right? So I can go both horizontally and vertically on my scale out solution for files. So I can address different use cases easily. One thing to note, just because we start with 3 Nutanix nodes and we have 3 file server VMs, it does not mean that those file server VMs are specifically pinned to those nodes, right? So if a node fails, that file server VM will be restarted to one of the other nodes, and I still have my 3 file server VMs, but I might be down to 2 physical nodes. So again, it's not a one-to-one match of file server VM to physical node. And I've had that question sometimes where, if I go from 3 to 4 Nutanix nodes, do I have to add a 4th file server VM for files? And the answer is no. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one match.
Interesting. So I mean, it sounds like the core concepts, right, map from both core infrastructure to files. So if you're familiar with kind of the resiliency factors and RF2 and RF3 that you can do with production infrastructure with Nutanix, those same concepts seem to apply pretty evenly to that same setup.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the way files does its data structure as well is files basically uses volumes on the Nutanix side. so the file server talks to the controller VM and does volume. It basically gets storage presented through volumes back to the file server VM. So in the event you lose your file server VM, you're not actually losing data, right? There's no data resident in that file server VM. So if a file server VM is corrupted or something like that happens, you can redeploy a file server VM to the files cluster, and all your data is still within the cluster. So it's not bound. We're not moving the data locality concept up into the file server VM like we have for everything else. It's using volumes from a storage connection to be able to get the file storage. So hopefully that makes sense. But it helps understand that the file servers are a little decoupled from the actual file data. That allows us to kind of have some flexibility there as well.
Okay. And that I think I've read that you can do this, but is it possible to link up Nutanix Files management with like a external storage solution? Is that something that is possible, or did I read something wrong on the internet?
Right? So you're bound. It's an interesting question. No, I mean, just like you can, and I guess I'm trying to think of what the use case there might be, but no, right? So Files doesn't address external storage.
Okay.
You can do, where I get along that line of kind of questioning, where I get some questions around is, we use Microsoft DFS, distributed file server, on to kind of scale out file shares within an environment. Does Files support DFS? Does it support DFSR? Microsoft DFSR is more of the DFS replication functionality that Nutanix Files does not work with, right? So
Okay.
Nutanix Files will work with Microsoft DFS. It will not work with DFSR specifically.
Okay. Nope. Thanks for the clarification on that. Let's jump in. I think we answered no new questions there. So this one I think comes up a lot, right? Is there a best use case for Nutanix Files? I know that we had mentioned kind of the announcement around GE's PAC solution and that being certified. So there's a lot of use cases within the in the medical field, right? But I know we've also seen video surveillance, right? We've got core infrastructure on Nutanix. We just had a bunch of body cameras and security cameras set up, and we need somewhere to place that. Any workloads that work best on Nutanix Files, and then on kind of the flip side of that, any file-like workloads to avoid?
Yeah, so I mean, let's go back to where Nutanix started, right? The VDI world, right? So Files really works well in a VDI type environment for storing of user profiles, right? If my VDI instances are in my Nutanix cluster, I've got data locality going there to make sure that those guys are flying. I've got shadow clone functionalities to make sure that as I clone VMs, they're being deployed as fast as possible. Well, why not keep our user data as close to those VMs as possible and be able to kind of take advantage of that? So from a Files perspective, I think one of the best Files workloads type that we look at is, if I'm a VDI, whether it's Horizon View, whether it's Citrix, whether it's Frame running in a Nutanix cluster, being able to use Files to store that user profile data, with FSLogix or Liquidware Profile Unity or whatever profile solution you're using, right there within the cluster itself, kind of helps really benefit that VDI environment from an end user perspective, keeping it as close as possible. I mean, that's one workload. I think that's kind of low hanging fruit. If I'm doing VDI with VMware, or VDI with Citrix, or VDI with Nutanix Frame, I'm putting my user profiles in Files in the cluster that I've got right there, right? That's an easy workload. I mean, anything else, right? If you've got unstructured data, if you've got just file shares, right? Department file shares, just file. I can think of environments that you go look at their file data, and they've got folders upon folders of just stuff they've kept over the years, right? Mm-hmm. That's great for Files, right? Being able to consolidate multiple file servers is another workload. I work with a vendor that when they deploy their solution, I think there's probably 10 or 15 file servers that are out there, 10 or 15 different file shares that they've got that are distributed across multiple machines, right? Well, I try to push Files to them and say, hey, instead of having 15 different locations, you've got to remember where data goes, or remember where this file was, or remember where that file was. Let's use Files to consolidate all these different file servers you've got into a single entity, right? Single pane of glass that I'm managing through Prism, instead of having these, 10 or 15 different Windows file servers or other file servers out there. So again, from a workload perspective, anytime you've got just file data or just unstructured data that's just kind of out there, right, that you want to be able to consolidate into a single entity, single pane of glass. Profiles are an easy one. I think so. There's a lot of workloads out there. You touched on like GE packs, just imaging systems that just have a dump of data. Document management systems. I think if I'm a law firm, right, I'm scanning every piece of paper that I've ever touched into a document management solution. Files is a good solution for that, right? I just need someplace to dump data to, keep it organized from a folder or hierarchy structure, but it's unstructured, and I don't have to either touch it a lot, or it's just I just need a location to store stuff in, right? Those are great workloads for files. One thing files won't support is like running VMs off it. We've seen people in the past run have a VMware environment that they run on an Isilon, have VMs running off of, right? Files will not support kind of running VMs off it as like an NFS, right? So if I'm if for whatever reason I need to store a VM there, I'm not going to be able to run a VM there. But again, from the files perspective and a workload perspective, I've touched on pretty much Windows file sharing, right? That's pretty much kind of been the use case. But files also supports NFS. So if I'm a Linux environment and I need to have NFS mounts or NFS exports to be able to store data in, I can use files for that. Now that doesn't mean like I can use NFS to store like my Oracle databases and files, things like that. That's a whole nother topic there. But from a files perspective, workloads, really anything unstructured where I have just a lot of data that I want to keep.
Awesome. Yeah, you mentioned kind of legal groups, right, in that use case. I know in working with some groups locally that a lot of orgs are using third-party providers for document management, and it turns out that those third-party providers are running on Nutanix. So sometimes you can kind of bring it in-house, right? If you're using a third party for kind of file storage as a service, peek behind the curtains and see what they're doing. It might be something that you can pull in-house and really kind of simplify and consolidate and benefit from with Nutanix.
And I love the idea of files is that, I can start small, right? I can start with that 1 TB, right? And we did this as a POC. We've done this as a POC for several customers where we start as a POC. We start, and it might not even be an official POC. It's, hey, they just got Nutanix. We also deployed files, and they used it, right? And then they're like, well, I've got 5 or 6 terabytes of other file data out there, right? I've got a file server I want to get rid of, things like that. Well, they start to look at, okay, can I use files more? Can I use files more? And again, since it's coming off of your already existing cluster from a storage perspective, at some point in time, you got to balance, do I need to add nodes to be able to have more file data? Or can I look at going to, if I know that I'm going to blow this up, think about a law firm or something that's got hundreds of terabytes of just historical data. I don't want to put that into my compute Nutanix cluster. Let me go ahead and build a standalone files cluster that's dedicated to just this, and then I can scale that up and out just like I would a compute cluster and easily migrate my file data from my existing cluster over, right? So you get the capability with files that you can mix and match files into an existing workload, but you can also take that file data and move it out into a dedicated workload. There's no sizing requirements for that dedicated workload, so I can start small. I can start with a 3-node dedicated files cluster and grow it infinitely, just like I can a normal compute cluster. So again, files, you get all that flexibility that's out there. All that flexibility that's out there, but the ability to kind of scale it as needed, right? Which is one of the best parts about it. The fact that, again, I deploy it 99% of the time for every net new Nutanix deployment I do. I throw files in there and I just tell the customer, hey, give it a run. If you don't like it or you find yourself not using it, we can easily pull it out, easily destroy it if you're not using it.
Awesome. So real quick, as we are kind of at the half-hour mark, for those of you that do need to drop, I just wanted to throw a quick note out. We do have another question in the chat and then one more slide to hit. But if you do want additional information or are interested in learning more about Nutanix, about Egroup, about both, about everything, keep an eye out for follow-up from Leanne. Her contact info is on the screen here. She'll be just reaching out for feedback, right? So far, we've hit security, we've hit VDI, we're hitting files today. We talked about core infrastructure. Let us know what you're thinking as far as what else is interesting, what other topics you want to see, and also if we can help with any initiatives that you have. So did want to just make that quick announcement there. If you got to drop, appreciate the time. But jumping back into it, the kind of what you talked about right at the end there, Mike, and then we'll get to the question that was posted in chat. But how is this sized out? What does it cost? I know the what does it cost question always comes up with all the stuff that we do, and mileage may vary, right? Sometimes it depends on the weather. It feels like, but what are some general guidelines that we can provide around? Hey, I need to kind of eyeball something. I'm not quite ready to start talking to my VAR yet, but what should people be thinking about and looking at information wise to start digging into this?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, right? It's a great question from the fact that it's one that's kind of easily solved, right? Nutanix Files, we size based on the amount of data you've got. So, if I was to size out a file solution, it's, oh, well, do you have 1 terabyte, 5 terabyte, 10 terabytes, 100 terabytes, right? And we work around that. So we look at, how much data are you going to store? Now, if it's going to be mixed and matched in a cluster with VMs or, other compute instances, well, we got to take all that into account. Then the nice thing about Files is I can fit it into an existing cluster pretty easily, right? Now, I'm bound by limits of hardware. I'm bound by limits of storage rights from Files. So we never want to overrun a single cluster with Files that has Files and compute where Files takes up too much to the detriment of compute capabilities, compute failover, things like that.
Right.
So again, it's simple math there, right? We size a Nutanix cluster with Files just like we size a Nutanix cluster with compute, right? What are our resources going to look like? What is the overall kind of growth pattern going to look like? Now, what does it cost perspective is kind of a simple one. It's based on amount of data that will be in Files. So again, you get one tibabyte. Remember, Nutanix uses the tibabyte instead of the terabyte. 1 tibabyte free with every Nutanix cluster. So if I deploy a Nutanix cluster today for a customer, they can use 1 tibabyte, no charge. Out of the box, they get it. If I've got two clusters, I can use 2 tibabytes, 1 in each cluster, right? And you can do the math. Now, if I say, okay, you know what? I really like this one. I like the file solution. I like what it's given me from a simplicity, single pane of glass perspective, and I need to grow it. Say I've got, I've got about another 3 terabytes of file data that I want to kind of consolidate here. Well, what I need to do then is I need to buy a license Files based on the amount I'm protecting or the amount of utilization, right? Mm-hmm. So I can buy a Files license for say 5 tibabytes, put 3 in there, and I've still got 2 tibabytes of free of availability, right? So I need to buy licensing based on the amount of tibabytes I'm going to have in Files. So if that's 2, well, then I need to have 2. If it's 5, 10, 100, I need to assign, have enough licensing that accommodates that. So from a cost perspective, of course, your mileage is going to vary, right? But you can basically it's a very simple thing to look at and say, if here's my cost for 5 tibabytes, well, I can kind of understand what that next 5 tibabytes also would look like from a cost perspective as well.
Okay. So basically anywhere from $10,000 to $1 billion is
exactly
the answer.
Right. Exactly. Talk cool. To your account executive.
Damn it. Couldn't get away from that, right?
Deploying it's easy. Paying for it's different.
Yes. No, but I mean, it sounds pretty straightforward, right? And I know Nutanix is pretty well versed in terms of their sizing tools, right? So it's I know we've done it pretty quickly for customers.
They're not difficult at all.
Yeah, well, that's why we'd like to work with you guys.
Yep.
Last question here, if there's nothing else, but I appreciate the additional question in the chat. And this one, I actually really like this question because it ties into kind of the ransomware that everybody's talking about. What type of visibility does Files give you into your data, and can it help me prevent malware? So great question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that is a great question, and that's one that I'd say recently. If we look at the history of Files, it's when Files first came out, it didn't have any sort of protection like this, right? We either looked at a third-party solution or something like that. But a couple of years ago, Nutanix released and is free for utilization, what they call file analytics. So it's kind of a bolt-on to it's a bolt-on to files, right? That we deploy into a cluster that allows us to have visibility into our data, right? So it allows us to see what type of files are being stored in our cluster, right? So I can look and say, why do I have 100,000 MPEGs, and I might be dating myself, or MP3s in my files cluster and 25 Word documents, right? Who's storing this stuff and why are we storing it this way? So file analytics basically consistently scans the files data to see what kind of data are we storing, who is connecting to this data. So one of the best things I've seen folks get out of this is the ability to say, why is this file being hit 100,000 times a day, but it's the person trying to open it doesn't have permissions, right? So you get audit logs of file access data. I get audit logs of access and denies to that data. So I've got again within a single pane of glass, I can now see what kind of data am I storing, how much size is that data taking up, right? So of each data type, how much overall size is that? I can see audits against files and folders. I can see why are people accessing it? Why is this file being accessed so many times? Why is it being denied? I can see easily capacity trends, right? So I can see like top 5 active users, right? That's another nice one that you get with file analytics is I can see, I can see why Dan Drude is accessing this one file in this file share over and over and over again, but nobody else is accessing this file. Or that you can see these access trends across your files infrastructure, which is really nice. So to the question that we've got, what type of visibility does files give you into your data? It gives you a very granular look into and saying, hey, here's all the data types that I've got. Here's the access into how people are accessing those files and folders, and then being able to kind of look at it and say, real-time monitoring of this and say, I'm going to set up a good use. I did this one with the customers. They wanted to have an alert that was flagged if there was some sort of, incredible amount of access to a specific file, right? So if there was, more than 10 accesses to this file every hour, flag it as an anomaly, right? So they got anomaly reports from a detection perspective that said, hey, something's going on. Let's check it out, right? So that's built in. So that's the files analytics piece to Nutanix Files, which is it's like I said, it's free. If you've got files, you've got it. It's a bolt-on piece that I deploy the files analytics server, and it constantly scans the files data and just gives you this easy report, easy data capture of what's out there for your file data. So great add-on, right? We've seen this with vendors like Varonis and other ones that kind of do this data scan against that live data and kind of give you some good feedback. So files analytics, as we see it grow, has a lot more capabilities coming in that allow you to really see and understand what kind of data you have and how that data is utilized.
Awesome. So it sounds like there's a lot in terms of the forensics and being able to identify what's going on. Preventing malware is another story, I think, but in terms of being able to kind of hone in on where or why, it sounds like there's a lot of visibility there.
Yeah, absolutely. You get great analytics, great kind of details. One of the best things I think you see is, hey, why are these files being accessed like they're being accessed? The other thing that I think where file analytics helps is the ability, you have these file shares. A lot of times people don't necessarily understand who has permissions to all the files and folders out there, right? So, a lot of times with these file shares, we don't do a great job of saying, oh, here's, this is the accounting folder. I need to kind of lock it down and make sure only the accounting folks can see it. The permissions kind of over time, they start to get muddied. They start to get lost in translation as we deploy more files, folders into our structure. File analytics helps you gives you a good view of, why are the folks in the HR department accessing the accounting folders and things like that, right? It might be that there's some data stuck in the accounting folder that HR needs to use, but you actually now can see that visibly of how this data is being accessed from who and from where. So again, that's a great feature that analytics has.
Awesome. Sounds helpful. So with that being said, it doesn't look like we have any additional questions in the queue here. So thanks to those of you that were able to stick this out to the end here. Appreciate the questions as well. And I think we'll have kind of our next few lining up. Again, I wanted to put Leanne's info out there. Be on the lookout for her follow-up as far as some feedback goes. And if you just need anything in general from Egroup, feel free to check us out. We do have a Twitter. I don't, but I know we've got a Twitter. Hop on LinkedIn. You can send us a note at info@egroup-us.com or give our main line a call if you need help routing. Obviously, myself and Mike Dent here can help out with anything as well. But keep an eye out for the next episode in our series. It'll be not next Wednesday, but the Wednesday after that. We'll be covering topics like data protection. We're going to be highlighting a customer story and what they're doing to help support a lot of mission critical systems across the country. And we'll kind of keep diving into core infrastructure as always. So. Mike, thanks again for your time and jumping on this with me, and thanks to those of you that were able to attend. And we will see you next time.
Absolutely, Dan. Pleasure.
All right, take care, everyone.